The dust of redemption. Texas was a fine red powder that got into a man's lungs and stayed there, a permanent stain on the soul. It coated the unpainted clapboard of the saloon, settled in the deep ruts of the main street, and clung to the sweat on Eli Boone's brow as he leaned against a support post, watching the town simmer under the brutal August sun of 1873. Heat warped the air, making the distant mesas tremble. It was a town built on thirst and desperation, and today it had an ugly spectacle to quench that thirst. Eli had been a cavalryman once, wore a blue coat, and followed orders that left a taste like rust in his mouth. Now he wore dust in the past like a second skin, drifting from one scorched piece of earth to the next, looking for nothing in particular except a quiet bottle and a way to forget the man he used to be. He had ridden into redemption 3 days ago, his horse favoring a front leg, and had been waiting on the blacksmith since. It was 3 days too long. A crowd had gathered in the town square, a loose, sweaty circle of ranchers, prospectors, and aimless drifters like himself. They were drawn by the promise of cheap whiskey and cheaper entertainment. In the center of the circle, on a makeshift platform of raw pine planks, stood Lyle Brackett. He was a man who had grown soft and thick on the misery of others. His fine waistcoat stretched taut over a belly full of greed. Beside him, a woman stood with her hands bound in front of her. She was Navajo. Eli knew it from the high line of her cheekbones, the straight fall of her raven black hair, and the proud, unbroken set of her jaw. She wore the tattered remnants of a traditional dress, but it was her eyes that held him. They were as dark and deep as a canyon at midnight, and in them he saw not fear, but a cold, burning fury that seemed to challenge the sun itself. She met the leering gazes of the men below, not as a victim, but as a judge. Eli felt the old sickness churn in his gut. He had seen this before, in the aftermath of skirmishes and so-called pacifications. He had seen human beings treated like chattel, their lives weighed on a scale of profit and loss. He had tried to wash the images from his mind with whiskey for 5 years, but they were a more stubborn stain than the dust. Lyle Brackett cleared his throat, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the parched ground. "Gentlemen, a fine specimen for your consideration. Strong back, good teeth, and quiet, taught to obey." He grabbed a handful of her hair and yanked her head back. She didn't cry out. Her glare only intensified, a silent promise of retribution. A low chuckle rippled through the crowd. Men nudged each other, their comments as crude and filthy as the street they stood on. Eli pushed himself off the post. He should walk away, ride out, lame horse or not, and leave this ugliness behind. It was not his fight. He had long since given up fighting for anything but his own miserable existence. Yet his boots felt nailed to the ground. He saw the flash of a blue coat in his memory, heard the screams that the wind couldn't carry away, and felt the phantom weight of a saber in his hand. The guilt was a physical thing, a rock in his belly. "Let's start the bidding at $20, Brackett boomed, his voice slick with avarice. $20 for a prime piece of property. Who'll give me 20? A grimy prospector with a wild beard raised a greasy hand. 20. "I got 20. Do I hear 30? Look at her, boys. Strong enough for field work. And I'm sure she'll keep you warm on a cold desert night." Another man, a rancher with a face burned the color of raw beef, yelled, 30. The bidding crept upwards, in increments of $5 and $10. Each bid was a hammer blow against Eli's conscience. The men were not buying a servant. They were buying a body, a vessel for their cruelty and loneliness. They were bidding on the right to break that defiant spirit he saw in her eyes. He watched her, standing ramrod straight amidst the degradation, a lone, unbending tree in a hurricane of filth. Her name, he would later learn, was Tala. But in that moment, she was the face of every sin he had ever committed or stood by and watched happen. $70, the rancher called, puffing out his chest. Brackett grinned. 70 going once, a bargain at twice the price. Gentlemen, Eli's hand went to the leather pouch on his belt. It held nearly everything he had in the world. Payment from his last job, wrangling horses across 2 territories. Enough to get him to California, maybe. Enough to start over, or at least to continue forgetting. 70 going twice. The image of a burning hogan flashed behind his eyes, the smell of pine and sage turning to ash. He could not outrun it. He could not drink it away. Maybe, just maybe, he could face it. His voice came out rougher than he intended, a stranger's voice tearing from his own throat. $100. The word fell into the square like a stone, and the ripples of chatter instantly died. Every head turned towards him. He stood alone, just outside the main press of the crowd, his face grim under the shadow of his hat brim. $100 was a horse, a good one. It was a stake in a poker game that could last all night. It was not a price you paid for a captive. Lyle Brackett's eyes narrowed, his professional smile faltering for a second. He did not know Eli from Adam. He saw a drifter, nothing more. $100 from the stranger. A bold bid. Sir, do I hear 110? The rancher, who had bid 70, spat on the ground, glaring at Eli with open hostility. He shook his head, muttering something about a fool and his money. The other men just stared, their expressions a mixture of confusion and resentment. This was not part of the sport. The stranger had spoiled their fun with the sheer, sober weight of his bid. 100 it is, Brackett said, his voice regaining its oily confidence. Going once, going twice, he looked around, a showman milking the moment. Sold. To the tall gentleman in the dusty coat. Eli felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, sharp and unfriendly. He had not just bought a person. He had bought the scorn of an entire town. He walked forward, pushing through the now silent and parting crowd. He kept his hand away from his pistol, though every nerve screamed at him to be ready. He stepped up to the platform and untied the pouch from his belt, counting out the gold and silver coins into Brackett's waiting palm. Brackett's fingers closed around the money. She's all yours. Friend, a real firecracker. This one. You'll need a firm hand. Eli ignored him. He turned to the woman. Up close. He could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the bruises half hidden by her dark hair. He pulled a knife from his belt. She flinched, her body tensing, her eyes finally showing a flicker of something other than hate. It was a sliver of fear. He did not look at her face. He could not. Instead, he reached down and sawed through the thick rope binding her wrists. The fibers parted, and her hands fell free. They were raw and red from the chafing. He straightened up and took a step back, putting the knife away. You are free, he said, his voice low. Tala did not move. She rubbed her wrists, her gaze fixed on him, suspicious and sharp as flint. The crowd began to murmur. Words like traitor and lover drifted on the hot air, ugly and venomous. What'd you say, Brackett asked, stepping forward. Eli met his gaze. I said she is free. The bill of sale is for a person, not a horse. I bought her, and I am setting her free. A wave of disbelief, then anger, washed over the square. This was more than spoiling their fun. This was a judgment. It was an indictment of them all, and they knew it. Brackett's face purpled. Now hold on just a minute. You can't do that. That's bad for business. Your business is not my concern, Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned to Tala again. Go, get out of this town. Head east. You know the way better than I do. She stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face for the trick, the lie, the hidden angle. She saw the weariness there, the guilt etched into the lines around his own eyes. She saw a man as trapped as she was, just by different chains. She finally spoke, her voice raspy from thirst and disuse, but strong. You bought me. It was not a question. It was an accusation. I bought your freedom, he corrected. Freedom cannot be bought by a white man's money, she shot back, her voice laced with a bitterness so profound it startled him. It is taken. It is earned. You did not free me. You just changed the name of my master." Before he could answer, the town marshal pushed his way through the crowd, a portly man with a tin star pinned to a sweat-stained vest. "What is the trouble here?" "Lyle. This fella's trying to stir up trouble. Marshal bought this woman fair and square and now claims he's setting her loose. It's unnatural." The marshal looked from Brackett's furious face to Eli's stoic one. "Son, what you do with your property is your business. But what these men are saying is true. You are upsetting the peace." "The peace was upset long before I got here," Eli said. He looked at Tala, who had not taken her eyes off him. He saw the pride warring with the humiliation, the flicker of hope being suffocated by a lifetime of mistrust. He had done this thing to quiet a ghost inside himself, but he had only made it worse for her. He had made her a symbol, a flashpoint. If he left her here now, she would be torn apart by the wolves he had provoked. He let out a slow breath, the red dust filling his lungs. "She is with me," he said, the words tasting like a life sentence. The decision settled over him, heavy as a burial shroud. He had just anchored himself to the very thing he had been running from. He had bought himself a conscience. He turned to Tala, his expression grim. "Come on." He stepped off the platform and began to walk towards the livery stable, not looking back to see if she was following. He could feel her presence behind him, a hesitant shadow in the oppressive heat. He could feel the hatred of the town at his back, a physical force. He walked on, his boots crunching in the dust, each step taking him further from the ghost of a future he had imagined and deeper into the past he could never escape. He had meant to perform an act of justice, a small act of atonement, but as he heard her soft footsteps fall into rhythm with his own, he understood the truth of her words. He had not freed her. He had only chained her to him, and in doing so, he had chained himself right back. The road out of redemption was now a path for two, and he had a sinking feeling it led straight back to the hell he'd been trying to leave behind. They left the festering sore of redemption behind them. Two solitary figures swallowed by an endless expanse of ochre and burnt sienna. Eli rode his mended horse, a sturdy bay that moved with a grim, plodding rhythm. Tala walked. She walked with a straight-backed resolve that infuriated him, her feet sure on the cracked earth as if she were a part of it. He had offered her the horse. He had gestured for her to ride, and he would walk. She had looked at the animal, then at him, and her eyes had communicated a refusal so complete and contemptuous that words were unnecessary. So he rode, and she walked, a few paces behind, a silent accusation in the space between them. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brass sky. It beat down on the land, leaching the color from the sagebrush and baking the ground into a mosaic of fissures. Heat radiated upwards in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon until the distant, flat-topped mesas seemed to float on a phantom lake. There was no sound but the plod of the horse's hooves, the soft scuff of Tala's worn moccasins, and the dry, whispering wind that carried the grit of the desert into their mouths and eyes. Above, a single hawk circled on the thermal currents, a patient, dark speck against the blinding blue. It watched them, a predator observing the struggles of lesser creatures, waiting for one of them to fall. For 2 days, they moved through this furnace in near silence. At night, Eli would build a small, smokeless fire of greasewood. He would share his meager rations of jerky and hardtack, placing her portion on a flat rock between them. She would eat, her movements deliberate and graceful, and then retreat to the edge of the firelight, wrapping herself in a thin blanket he had given her. She slept facing away from him, a rigid line of defiance even in slumber. He would stay awake long after, his hand resting on the colt at his hip, listening to the yip of distant coyotes and the louder, more unsettling beat of his own conscience. He was not her jailer, he told himself. He was her protector, but the line between the two felt as thin and sharp as a razor's edge. The silence finally broke on the third morning. The landscape had grown harsher, a broken land of rock and thorn where only the hardiest things survived. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the morning stillness with the clarity of shattered glass. He reined in the horse and turned in the saddle to look at her. Her face was smudged with dust, but her eyes were clear and bright with an unyielding fire. Away from that town, north, we will find a crossing over the Cimarron River. My people are not north, they are east, towards the Chusca Mountains. He knew that. He also knew that the direct path east would take them through territory crawling with men like Lyle Brackett. Men who would see a white man with a Navajo woman and ask questions with bullets. The trails east will be watched. This way is safer. Safer for who? She countered, her gaze unwavering. For you. You take me through this wasteland, away from my home. You are no different from the men who captured me. You just use a longer chain. The accusation struck a nerve, raw and painful because it felt true. He was a man who had lost his faith in everything, most of all himself. He operated on a grim sort of pragmatism, the kind a man learns when he has seen the absolute worst of human nature. Her spirit, this burning, unquenchable life force, was something he no longer understood. It was like staring into the sun. I am trying to keep you alive, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. I know how to stay alive. I have been doing it long before you and your $100 arrived. She was right. The proof was in the way she moved, the way she read the land, pointing to a seep of alkali water he would have missed, identifying the edible roots of a yucca plant with a certainty that came from generations of knowledge. She was a survivor. He was just a ghost, haunted by the past, trying to buy his way out of hell with a single good deed. He turned the horse and rode on. The conversation finished, but the tension remained, thicker than the dust. He could feel her watching him, testing him, waiting for a moment of weakness. He did not have to wait long. That afternoon, while he was refilling their canteens at a muddy, brackish spring, she vanished. One moment she was standing by a cluster of rocks, her silhouette sharp against the sky. The next, she was gone. There was no sound, no cry, just an unnerving emptiness where she had been. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He cursed himself for his stupidity, for dropping his guard. He scrambled up the rocks, scanning the horizon. He saw a flicker of movement far to the southeast, a lone figure moving with surprising speed, a dark shape against the red earth. She was running home. A part of him, the weary, broken part, wanted to let her go. She had made her choice. It was her life, her risk. He could turn north, ride on, and be free of this burden he had placed on himself. But the image of her on that platform, her defiant eyes, returned to him. He thought of Brackett's men, of the bounty hunters who would surely follow. They would not be buying her freedom. He swore, a bitter, guttural sound, and vaulted into the saddle, kicking the tired horse into a labored gallop. He followed her tracks, easily visible in the sandy soil. She was clever, using rocky ground where she could, but the desert was too vast, too open. He was closing the distance when the sky began to change. The brilliant blue faded to a sickly, bruised yellow. The wind, which had been a constant, dry whisper, began to moan, a low, keening sound that rose in pitch. On the western horizon, the sky was darkening, not with clouds, but with a solid, rolling wall of brown. It was a sandstorm, a haboob, one of the desert's furies, and it was moving towards them with terrifying speed. Eli had been caught in one before. He knew the suffocating, blinding power of it. He yelled her name, his voice snatched away by the rising gale. Tala! He saw her falter, looking back at him and then at the approaching wall of dust. She was too far from any real shelter. He spurred the horse harder, the animal's sides heaving. The wind was a physical blow now, flinging sand and pebbles that stung his exposed skin. The sun vanished, swallowed by the roiling chaos. Darkness fell upon the afternoon. He could barely see 20 feet in front of him. He lost sight of her. He pulled the bandana up over his nose and mouth, His eyes slitted against the assault. He dismounted, keeping a firm grip on the reins. The horse whinnied in terror, trying to bolt. He had to fight to control it. He yelled her name again, a desperate, raw cry into the throat of the storm. There was no answer but the scream of the wind. He had to find her. The thought was not born of guilt or a need for atonement. It was a primal, urgent command that bypassed all his weary cynicism. He had to find her. He tied the horse to a stunted, thorny mesquite, hoping it would hold, and pushed forward on foot, leaning into the wind. The world was a maelstrom of roaring wind and stinging sand. He was blind, deaf, and suffocating. He moved by instinct, stumbling over rocks, pushing through the gale, his only guide the direction he had last seen her. He found her huddled at the base of a small rock outcropping, a formation that offered almost no protection. She had pulled her blanket over her head, a small, dark mound against the tide of sand. He fell to his knees beside her, grabbing her arm. She started, trying to pull away, but he held fast. He pulled her up, shouting into her ear to be heard over the storm. "Come on, we have to move." She fought him for a second, her fear and mistrust still warring with the instinct for survival. But the sheer violence of the storm was undeniable. She let him pull her along. He led her back towards the horse, a grueling, step-by-step battle against the elements. The wind threatened to tear them apart. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her tight against him, using his body to shield her as best he could. He felt the frailness of her frame, but also the unyielding strength within it. They were just two small, fragile things against the immense, impersonal power of the desert. He found the horse, a phantom shape in the gloom. He untied the reins and, still holding on to Tala, he led them into the slight lee of a larger rock formation he had spotted earlier. It was not a cave, merely an overhang, but it broke the main force of the wind. They collapsed into the small pocket of relative calm, the roar of the storm still deafening around them. The horse stood with its back to the wind, head down, enduring. Eli and Tala huddled together, shoulders touching, not out of comfort, but necessity. The air was thick with dust, making every breath a struggle. For a long time, they did not speak. There was nothing to say. The storm said it all. It had stripped them down to their essential selves. Two people fighting to breathe in a world turned to chaos. He looked at her. Her hair was matted with sand, her face a pale mask in the gloom. She was looking out into the storm, her expression unreadable. He had saved her. He had risked his own life to pull her from the path of the storm. And he knew, in that moment of terrible clarity, that it had nothing to do with the ghosts of his past. He had done it for her. The realization did not bring him peace. It terrified him more than the storm. Protecting a symbol of his guilt was a simple, selfish act. Protecting her, the woman of fire and fury, the woman who looked at him with eyes full of righteous anger, was something else entirely. It was a responsibility he did not want, for a feeling he could not name. The storm passed as if it had never been, leaving the world scoured and silent. The air, cleansed of dust, was crystalline, in the new, sharp light. The land was revealed in all its brutal majesty. They were in a country of red rock, a vast, silent cathedral of stone sculpted by wind and time into colossal monuments, balanced rocks, and deep, shadowed canyons. The sand, now damp and dark, was packed hard, making the way easier. They traveled for the rest of the day without speaking. The shared ordeal of the storm had stripped away the layers of anger and suspicion, leaving behind a raw, fragile awareness of each other. He was no longer just the white man who had bought her, and she was no longer just the symbol of his guilt. They were two people who had huddled together against a force that could have extinguished them both. The silence was no longer a weapon between them, but a space they could both inhabit. As twilight began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, Eli found a place to make camp. It was a shallow alcove at the base of a towering sandstone mesa. sheltered on 3 sides by the warm, radiating rock. He slid from the saddle, his movements stiff with exhaustion, while the horse drank gratefully from a pool of rainwater collected in a hollow of the rock. Eli gathered dried juniper branches and gnarled pieces of mesquite. Tala watched him. She sat on a flat ledge, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her posture relaxed for the first time since he had known her. The fear was gone. In its place was a deep, thoughtful stillness. She watched his hands, capable and sure, as he arranged the wood in a small, tight cone. She watched him strike a match, shielding the tiny flame with his body until it caught, licking at the dry wood. The fire grew steadily, a living thing in the deepening dusk. It pushed back the shadows and created a small circle of warmth and light, an island of safety in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Eli had been lucky. He had managed to shoot a lean jackrabbit that morning, and he set about skinning and cleaning it with an efficient lack of ceremony. He spitted the meat on a green stick and set it over the flames. The smell of roasting meat soon filled the small space, a rich, savory aroma that spoke of life and sustenance. He made no demands of her, gave no orders. He simply worked, his movements economical, his focus entirely on the task at hand. When the meat was cooked, he pulled it from the fire and divided it, laying her share on a piece of clean, flat sandstone he had warmed by the flames. He sat on the other side of the fire and began to eat, his gaze directed at the dancing heart of the fire. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the burning wood and the small noises of their meal. The quiet was different now. It was a shared quiet, comfortable and profound. The firelight played across Tala's face, softening the hard lines of her anger and revealing a deep, abiding sorrow in her eyes. "The smell of the juniper smoke," she said, her voice soft as the dusk. "It reminds me of my home. Our fires always smelled of juniper and piñón." Eli stopped chewing, his hand frozen halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a problem to be solved or a duty to be fulfilled, but as a person filled with memories. He nodded for her to continue. "My grandmother, she would tell stories by the fire, stories of the first man and the first woman, of how the holy people taught the dying to walk in beauty. She would weave as she spoke, her hands moving like spiders, making patterns that told the stories in wool." She paused, her eyes looking past the fire, into a world he could not see. "I had a dream once, that I would have many sheep, that I would teach my own daughters the patterns, the songs, that I would grow old and see my grandchildren playing in the sunlight near our hogan. It was a simple dream." Her voice broke on the last word, a single, sharp note of pain in the quiet evening. She did not weep. Her grief was too old, too deep for tears. It was a solid thing, a stone she carried inside her. "The soldiers came at dawn." She continued, her voice flat now, reciting a story she had told herself 1,000 times. "They came with their blue coats and their long knives. They burned the hogans. They shot the sheep. They took the people, my grandmother. She tried to sing a blessing, to calm their spirits. A soldier shot her where she stood. I saw it. I saw everything. They chained us together and marched us away from the ashes of our world." The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks into the air. Each spark was a tiny, dying star. Eli felt the weight of her words settle over him, colder and heavier than any winter night. The blue coat, the long knives. He had worn that coat. He had carried that knife. He set his food aside, the taste of ashes in his mouth. "My first campaign," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It was in the Canyon de Shelly. Years ago, we were told we were bringing peace, that we were moving the Navajo to a new home, a better place." He looked up from the fire, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. The firelight hollowed out his face, making his guilt a visible thing. "We were told it was for their own good. But the faces of the women, the old ones, the children, they did not look like they were being saved. We burned their peach orchards to the ground. We slaughtered their flocks. We were not soldiers. We were destroyers. I followed my orders. I held the rifle. I watched homes burn. And when it was over, I could not wash the smell of the smoke from my skin. It is still there. He held up his hands in the firelight. They were scarred and calloused. A man's hands. To him, they looked stained with a filth that would never come clean. "That is why you bought me," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a moment of absolute, devastating clarity. You were buying an apology. You were trying to wash the smoke away. Yes, he admitted, the word a stone in his throat. She was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on him. He expected anger, revulsion, a final, damning judgment. He deserved it. He waited for it, but when she spoke again, her voice held no hatred. It held a strange, sad wisdom. "The chains they put on me were made of iron. I could feel them on my skin. The chains you carry are inside you. They are heavier." She looked from his face to the fire, then back again. A new understanding was dawning in her eyes. She was seeing not a white man, not a former soldier, but a fellow prisoner, trapped in a different kind of bondage. She leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the fierce intelligence in her eyes. Freedom is not a gift a man can give. Eli Boone, it is not something you can buy with $100 to quiet your ghosts. It is something you must take for yourself. You must earn it. You must fight for it until you can breathe the air and not taste the smoke. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She had seen the truth of him, the rotten core of his noble act. He had not been saving her. He had been trying to save himself. All this time he had seen himself as her protector, her rescuer, when in fact he was just as lost, just as chained, as she had been on that auction block. For the first time since he had ridden away from the army, a flicker of something other than guilt or weary cynicism stirred within him. She had not offered him forgiveness. She had offered him a truth that was far more valuable. She had shown him a path. He looked at her, this woman of unbreakable spirit, and for the first time, he saw not a Navajo, not a victim, but a person of formidable strength. He had thought he was holding the power in their relationship. He had been wrong. He picked up a stick and pushed a log deeper into the flames. The fire blazed up, bright and hot, consuming the wood, transforming it into light and heat. It was a light, and it was a burning memory. In its glow, two people, a man and a woman from worlds that were at war, sat in a fragile truce, bound not by iron chains or a bill of sale, but by the shared, terrible knowledge of what it meant to be unfree. And in that shared knowledge, a pact was silently forged, a promise to see the person, not the past. Word travels fast in a thirsty town. It flows on whispers of whiskey and envy. The story of the drifter who paid $100 for a Navajo woman and then set her free was a tale too strange and too insulting to be contained by the dusty limits of redemption. It found its way to the ears of Lyle Brackett as he sat in the saloon, nursing a glass of bourbon and the deep bruise to his pride. He was a man who understood the world in terms of ownership and control. Eli Boone had walked into his town, paid his price, and then publicly declared that Brackett's rules, his very business, were meaningless. It was an act of rebellion he could not tolerate. It undermined the foundation of fear and greed upon which he had built his small empire. He sat at a back table with two men he kept on his payroll for just such occasions. One was a wiry man named Jed with nervous, shifting eyes that missed nothing. The other was Marcus, a heavy, slow-thinking man whose only real skill was a capacity for casual brutality. Brackett swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his thick fingers looking pale against the dark wood of the table. He told them the man's name was Boone, a former soldier, apparently, with more money than sense and a misplaced conscience. He had gone north, taking the property with him. Brackett did not care about the man. He wanted the woman back. It was a matter of principle, he explained, his voice a low growl. It was a matter of business. You cannot have people thinking they can just undo a transaction. It is bad for the economy of things. Jed asked what the pay was. Brackett smiled. A cold, thin expression that did not reach his eyes. $50, he said, for the woman's return, unharmed. He stressed the word unharmed. She was valuable property, after all. As for the man, Boone, he did not care what happened to him. In fact, he would prefer it if Boone simply disappeared. An accident in the desert, a snake bite. These things happen. He pushed a stack of coins across the table for expenses. Bring her back, he ordered. Jed and Marcus nodded, pocketed the money, and left the saloon without another word. Brackett finished his bourbon, the fire in his belly a satisfying match for the fire of his anger. Far out in the Red Rock country, the tentative peace between Eli and Tala held. The days that followed their campfire confession were marked by a new kind of silence. The space between them was no longer filled with suspicion, but with a quiet, watchful respect. He began to see the desert through her eyes. She would point to a plant he had thought was a useless weed and explain how its roots could be ground for flour. She found a hidden spring, its location marked by a particular formation of rocks and a nearly invisible patch of greener foliage that his untrained eye had dismissed. She moved through the harsh landscape not as a trespasser, but as a native daughter returning to a difficult but familiar home. In turn, she began to see him differently. He was no longer just the ghost of a blue-coated soldier. She saw the way he cared for the horse, his hands gentle as he checked for stones in its hooves. She watched him clean his pistol every evening, his movements precise and ingrained, a ritual of a life defined by violence. Yet there was a sadness in it, a weariness. He was a man who knew how to kill but seemed to take no pleasure in it. He was a guardian by habit, and she was slowly beginning to believe that he guarded her life as fiercely as he guarded his own. They were becoming a team, an unspoken partnership forged by necessity. He provided the protection of his gun and his knowledge of the white man's world. She provided the ancient knowledge of the land that kept them fed and hydrated. They were two halves of a single, functioning whole. The thought was unsettling to them both, a strange intimacy that neither knew how to acknowledge. On the fourth night after the storm, they made camp in a narrow canyon where the wind whispered through strange, hoodoo rock formations. The moon was a slender sliver, and the stars were a brilliant, cold spray across the blackness. The fire was small, a concession to the open country and the need to remain unseen. They ate in their now customary quiet, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows that made the rocks look like silent, watching giants. Eli felt it first, a prickling on his skin, a tightening in his gut. A soldier's instinct, buried but not dead. It was the unnatural stillness, the way the night insects had suddenly gone quiet. He slowly, casually, set down his tin plate. His hand moved to rest on the grip of his Colt. Tala saw the change in him. Her eyes darted to his, and she read the warning there. She did not make a sound. She froze, her body becoming as still as the rocks around her, her senses straining to catch whatever it was he had felt. Then he heard it, the soft scrape of a boot on sandstone, coming from the rocks above and to their left. It was a careless sound, but in the profound silence of the canyon, it was as loud as a gunshot. He was on his feet in a single, fluid motion, the pistol in his hand. "Get back," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. He pushed her behind a large boulder near the back of their small camp. The horse, sensing the tension, snorted nervously and stamped a hoof. A voice called out from the darkness, a lazy, confident drawl. "No need for that, friend. We are just looking for something that belongs to our employer." Another voice, deeper and duller, added from another direction, "The woman, just send her out, and we will be on our way." Jed and Marcus? Eli knew it without seeing them. Brackett's men. His heart sank. He had hoped he had been careful enough, that their trail was cold. He had been wrong. He raised his voice, keeping it steady. She is not with me. You are mistaken." Jed chuckled from the darkness, a humorless, grating sound. "We followed your tracks for 3 days. Boone, we know she is there. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." The first shot came without warning. A muzzle flashed from the rocks, and a bullet whined past Eli's ear, smacking into the canyon wall behind him. The sound of the shot echoed, a sharp crack that shattered the night. Eli dropped into a crouch, firing back at the flash. He heard a curse from the darkness. The night erupted into chaos. Gun flashes lit the canyon in brief, stark tableaus. Eli used the fire for what little cover it offered, moving from rock to rock, making himself a difficult target. He was one man against at least 2, and they had the high ground. He fired again, and a ricochet sent a shower of stone chips flying. The horse screamed, a sound of pure terror, and broke its tether, galloping wildly down the canyon and into the darkness. Their only way out was gone. Behind the boulder, Tala watched with a cold, focused rage. This was happening again. Men with guns, coming in the night to take her, to chain her. She would not let it happen. Her eyes scanned the small campsite. She saw Eli's hunting knife lying near his discarded plate. She crept forward, a shadow moving against the shadows, and her fingers closed around the handle. It was not a gun, but it was something. It was a weapon. Eli was pinned down. Marcus was laying down a steady, if inaccurate, fire from above, keeping his head down, while Jed was trying to circle around to the side. Eli knew he had only a few seconds before he was caught in a crossfire. He risked a glance towards the boulder where Tala was hiding. He needed to draw them away from her. He bolted from his cover, running towards a different cluster of rocks, firing as he went. As he had hoped, their attention followed him. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet. He made it to the new position, panting, his ears ringing from the gunshots. He did not see the movement in the shadows near their original camp. Tala, seeing her chance while the men were distracted, did not hesitate. In her hand was not the knife, but a thick branch she had pulled from the fire. One end was a glowing, angry red, trailing smoke and embers. She moved with a speed born of desperation, her moccasined feet silent on the sand. Jed was creeping along the canyon wall, his focus entirely on Eli's new position, his pistol held ready. He did not see or hear her until it was too late. She came at him from the side, a furious spirit of the night, and swung the burning brand with all her strength. She screamed as she did it, a raw, piercing cry that was part battle cry, part a release of all her pent-up rage and grief. The glowing end of the branch caught him across the face. He shrieked in pain and surprise, dropping his gun and clawing at his eyes. The smell of scorched flesh filled the air. Eli saw his chance. He fired twice in quick succession at the other muzzle flash. The second shot was met with a heavy, wet thud, and then silence. Marcus was down. Jed, blinded and screaming, was stumbling around in the darkness. Eli moved in, his pistol aimed. He stopped when he saw Tala. She stood over the fallen man, the firebrand held like a spear, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a terrifying light. She looked like a goddess of vengeance. A gunshot from the ground. Jed, writhing in agony, had found his pistol. He fired wildly. Tala cried out, more in surprise than pain, as a bullet tore through the fleshy part of her arm. Eli did not hesitate. He fired a single, final shot. The canyon fell silent again. The only sound was the crackle of the dying fire and Tala's ragged breathing. Eli rushed to her side. Blood was welling from a long gash on her upper arm. She looked at the wound, then at him, her eyes wide with shock. He took her good arm and pulled her further into the shadows, his own pistol still ready, scanning the rocks. They waited for a long time, listening, but there was no sound. The battle was over. The adrenaline began to fade, and a searing pain bloomed in Eli's left shoulder. He looked down. His shirt was dark and wet. He touched it, and his fingers came away sticky with blood. During his run to the new cover, one of Marcus's bullets had found its mark. He sank to the ground, leaning his back against a rock, the pistol suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. The canyon began to tilt, the brilliant stars blurring into streaks of light. Tala saw him sway. The shock in her own eyes was replaced with a fierce, new urgency. She tore a long strip from the hem of her dress and pressed it against her own bleeding arm, a makeshift bandage. Then she went to him. She knelt in front of him in the dim, flickering light of the fire. She reached out to touch his shoulder, but her hand stopped. Hovering in the air for a second, her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with a profound and terrifying hesitation, as if she were about to touch something sacred or forbidden. This man, this stranger, this enemy who had become her protector, was now bleeding in front of her. His life was in her hands. She took a deep breath, and her resolve hardened. Gently, carefully, she tore away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The wound was ugly, a deep graze that had gouged a furrow along the muscle. It was bleeding freely. She took his canteen and, without a word, began to clean the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle. He hissed in pain as the water washed over the raw flesh, but he did not pull away. He just watched her face, illuminated by the dying embers of their fire. He saw the intense concentration in her eyes, the set of her jaw. In that moment, she was not his captive, and he was not her savior. They were just a man and a woman in a vast, dark wilderness, and she was fighting to keep him alive. Dawn broke over the canyon, painting the rock in shades of rose and gold. The light brought no warmth, only a stark illumination of the night's carnage. The two men lay where they had fallen, their bodies already beginning to draw the interest of flies. The air was still and heavy with the metallic scent of blood. Eli was weak, a deep throb of pain pulsing in his shoulder with every beat of his heart. A fever was beginning to cloud the edges of his vision. Tala worked with a grim and silent efficiency. She took what she could from the dead men's supplies: a half-full canteen of water, a small pouch of dried jerky, and a handful of bullets for Eli's pistol. She found their horses, but they had bolted too far in the night to track. They were on foot. Her own arm ached, but the wound was clean. His was not. She knew from the heat radiating from his shoulder and the glassy look in his eyes that infection was setting in. If they did not find help, the wound would claim him. She got him to his feet. He swayed, leaning heavily on her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She was no longer the captive. She was the anchor. He was no longer the protector. He was the burden. The desert had inverted their roles with a swift and brutal irony. She took his gun belt and buckled it around her own slender waist. The weight of it was unfamiliar, but solid and real. She then put his good arm over her shoulders and took much of his weight onto her own small frame. "We must walk," she told him, her voice leaving no room for argument. "There is a town, Sweetwater, 2 days west. I saw a sign for it once. Long ago." He could only nod, his head lolling. The journey was a fever dream, a blur of shimmering heat and stabbing pain. He was vaguely aware of the scratch of thorny brush against his legs, the relentless sun on the back of his neck, and the steady, unyielding presence of Tala beside him. She was the one who found the shade of a rock outcropping during the brutal heat of midday. She was the one who rationed the water, giving him the larger share, her own lips cracking from the dryness. When he stumbled, she held him up. When he collapsed, she sat with him, wiping his brow with a damp cloth until he found the strength to rise again. He saw not a woman, but a force of nature, as tough and resilient as the desert itself. On the evening of the second day, they saw it, a smudge of smoke on the horizon that slowly resolved itself into the angular shapes of wooden buildings. Sweetwater. The name promised relief, a cool drink, a safe place to rest. The reality was a grid of dusty streets lined with false-fronted buildings. all of them looking tired and bleached by the sun. It was another redemption, another pocket of civilization that felt more threatening than the empty wilderness. Their entrance into town did not go unnoticed. People stopped what they were doing to stare. A blacksmith paused with his hammer in midair. Women gathered on the boardwalk, their conversations falling to whispers as they watched the strange pair limp down the main street. They saw a white man, pale with fever and leaning on a Navajo woman as if his life depended on it. They saw the pistol on her hip. It was a sight that was wrong, unnatural, an offense to the rigid order of their world. The looks they received were a mixture of contempt, suspicion, and a kind of predatory curiosity. Tala felt the weight of their stares like a physical pressure, but her expression remained a mask of stoic resolve. She ignored them, her focus solely on the sign for a general store up ahead. They needed medicine, bandages, food. Inside the store, the air was cool and smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dust. A portly man with a magnificent mustache and a dirty apron stood behind the counter. He looked them over, his eyes lingering on Tala with open disdain before settling on Eli. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone making it clear they were not welcome. "My friend is hurt," Tala said, her voice quiet but firm. "We need carbolic acid, clean bandages, and laudanum if you have it." The storekeeper looked past her, directing his words only to Eli. "Is that right, you let your property do the talking for you?" Eli pushed himself upright, pulling away from Tala's support. His vision swam for a moment, but he held the counter to steady himself. "We need the medicine," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "And food, whatever you can spare." The storekeeper grunted and began to gather the items, slamming them down on the counter. His movements were deliberately slow. He named a price that was easily double what the goods were worth. Eli did not argue. He pulled out the small pouch of coins he had taken from Jed's body and paid the man. As they were about to leave, 3 cowboys pushed their way into the store. They were loud and smelled of cheap whiskey and sweat. They saw Eli and Tala and immediately stopped, a slow, malicious grin spreading across the face of their leader. A big man with a sunburned face and cruel, small eyes. "Well now, look what we have here," the man said, his voice a lazy drawl. "Looks like you found yourself a stray, mister." Eli ignored him, taking the parcel of supplies from the counter. "Come on," he said to Tala. But the big cowboy stepped in front of Tala, blocking her way. His eyes roamed over her, insolent and possessive. "She is a quiet one. Is not she? I bet you could have some fun with her. How much did you pay for her? I will give you $10. Tala's entire body went rigid. Her hand instinctively went to the hilt of the knife at her belt. Eli stepped between them, his body a weak but determined shield. "She is not for sale. Get out of the way." The cowboy laughed, a short, ugly sound. He looked at Eli's pale, sweating face, at the blood stain on his shoulder. "You do not look like you are in much of a position to give orders," he sneered. He gave Eli a hard shove. Eli stumbled backward, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain, but rage, pure and absolute, burned through the fog of fever. He launched himself forward, not with skill or strength, but with a raw, desperate fury. He slammed his fist into the cowboy's jaw. The man grunted in surprise, staggering back. The store dissolved into chaos. The other 2 cowboys jumped in. Eli fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal. He was weaker, outnumbered, but his army training gave him a brutal efficiency. He broke one man's nose with a sharp elbow. He kicked the other in the knee, sending him howling to the floor. But the big cowboy recovered and landed a heavy punch to Eli's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Eli fell to his knees, gasping for air. The big cowboy stood over him, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip with the back of his hand. He was about to kick Eli when he turned his attention back to Tala, who stood pressed against the counter, her eyes blazing. "Now," he said, advancing on her, "as for you, you are going to learn some manners." He reached for her. Tala did not scream. She did not cower. She reacted with the same swift, instinctual ferocity she had shown in the canyon. She did not reach for the knife or the gun. She did something far more insulting. She grabbed the hem of her own ragged, filthy skirt, the garment that was a symbol of her poverty and her station. With a sharp, tearing sound, she ripped a large piece of the dusty fabric free. Before the man could comprehend what she was doing, she lunged forward and whipped the dirty, grit-filled cloth across his face. It was an act of supreme contempt. She was striking him not with a weapon, but with the very dirt he saw her as. The man roared in shock and pain as the coarse fabric and sharp grit scratched his skin and filled his eyes. He stumbled back, sputtering and clawing at his face, temporarily blinded. The fight stopped. Everyone froze. The storekeeper stared, his mouth agape. The injured cowboys looked on in disbelief. Eli, on his hands and knees and fighting for breath, looked up and saw the cowboy, spitting dust and cursing. And he saw Tala, standing tall, her chest heaving, a defiant queen in her tattered dress. A strange sound escaped Eli's lips. It was a short, choked bark, half a gasp of pain, half a laugh. The sheer, magnificent audacity of her act was a brilliant flash of light in the middle of a dark and ugly world. He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, at the stunned brute in front of her, and a real, genuine grin spread across his face, despite the agony in his shoulder and ribs. "Sweet Jesus," he wheezed, the words coming out in a painful puff of air. "You are trouble." The spell was broken. The storekeeper started yelling for the marshal. The big cowboy, his vision clearing, looked at Tala with murder in his eyes. Eli used the counter to haul himself to his feet. He grabbed their parcel of supplies with his good hand and took Tala's arm. They stumbled out of the store and into the hostile sunlight of Sweetwater, leaving a trail of chaos, confusion, and a cloud of settling dust behind them. They fled Sweetwater with the town's fury at their heels, a chorus of shouted threats and curses chasing them out into the unforgiving plains. Eli was running on little more than fever and raw nerve. Every jarring step sent a fresh wave of agony through his shoulder, and the punch to his ribs had left him breathless. Tala, a small, fierce presence at his side, half carried, half dragged him onward, her eyes scanning the horizon for a pursuer who never came. The town, it seemed, was content to spit them out, to let the desert finish the job. They did not stop until the angry smudge of the town was long gone, swallowed by the heat haze behind them. Eli collapsed in the meager shade of a lone, skeletal Palo Verde tree, his body finally surrendering. He was shivering despite the oppressive heat, and his skin was clammy to the touch. Tala knelt beside him, her face a mask of grim concern. She opened the parcel of supplies they had fought for, her hands moving with a practiced economy. She cleaned his wound again with the carbolic acid, her touch firm but gentle. He clenched his jaw, a low groan escaping his lips, but he let her work. She bandaged him tightly with fresh linen, the clean white a stark contrast to the grime and blood on his skin. As she finished, she noticed the sky. The brilliant, punishing blue of the afternoon was gone. The western horizon had taken on a strange, greenish-yellow tinge, the color of a fresh bruise. The air had grown heavy and still, the kind of oppressive silence that comes before a breaking point. A low, almost imperceptible rumble vibrated through the soles of her moccasins. "Another storm," she said, her voice flat, a bad one. Eli pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against the tree's trunk. He looked at the sky, and the old soldier in him recognized the signs of an impending assault. This was not a dust storm. This was a summer monsoon, a violent electrical fury that could turn the dry arroyos into raging torrents in a matter of minutes. "We need cover," he rasped, his voice rough. "High ground, a cave, anything." She nodded, her gaze sweeping the broken landscape. Far to the north, a series of low, rocky mesas broke the monotony of the plain. It was their only chance. She helped him to his feet once more, and they began the slow, agonizing trek towards the distant rocks. The storm came on them faster than they could have imagined. The sky darkened to a deep, angry purple. The wind began to rise, not a whisper, but a mournful howl that whipped dust and loose pebbles into their faces. The first drops of rain were fat and cold, hitting the parched earth with a sizzle and leaving dark, spreading spots on the ground. Then the heavens opened. It was not rain. It was a solid, vertical wall of water, a deluge that instantly soaked them to the bone and turned the ground under their feet to a slick, treacherous mud. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, followed moments later by claps of thunder so loud they felt like physical blows. In the strobe, like flashes of light, the desert was transformed into a terrifying, alien landscape. They were near the base of the mesas when Tala spotted it, a dark slash in the rock face, half hidden by a curtain of scraggly creosote bushes. A cave. She pulled Eli towards it, her strength renewed by the promise of shelter. They scrambled inside just as a particularly violent gust of wind tore past, threatening to rip them from the face of the rock. The cave was not large, a shallow, sandy-floored hollow that smelled of dust and damp stone. But it was dry. They collapsed just inside the entrance, shivering and breathless. The roar of the storm, a deafening wall of sound just outside. Lightning flashes illuminated the interior in stark, momentary flashes of white, followed by a profound, echoing darkness. For a long time they just sat there, listening to the fury of the storm, catching their breath. The world outside had dissolved into a roaring chaos of wind and water. Inside the small, dark space, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of their hearts. The cave was a refuge, but it was also a cage, trapping them together in the dark. Tala built a small, hesitant fire with the last of their dried tinder and some wood she found in the back of the cave. The small flame pushed back the darkness, casting their enlarged, flickering shadows against the rough stone walls. The meager warmth did little to stop their shivering. She looked at him in the firelight. The fever was burning brightly in his eyes, and a fresh stain of red was beginning to seep through his new bandage. The fight and the flight had taken their toll. She unwrapped the bandage to examine the wound. It was inflamed, the edges raw and angry. She cleaned it again as best she could. He endured her touch in silence, his gaze fixed on her face with a strange intensity. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper above the storm's roar. She paused in her work, looking up at him. "Why what? Why are you doing this in the store? And now, helping me? After everything, I bought you. I chained you to me. You should have left me under that tree." She finished tying off the bandage before she answered. She looked not at him, but at the fire, her profile etched in gold and shadow. "Leaving you to die would make me no better than the men who left my people to die in the dust. My body was captive. Eli Boone. My spirit was not. There is a difference." He sank back against the cave wall, a shudder running through him that had nothing to do with the cold. The simple dignity of her words was a sharper rebuke than any curse. "The cowboy in town," he said, forcing the words past his dry lips. "He called you trouble." He was right. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "To men like him, a woman who will not bend is always trouble." "No," Eli said, shaking his head slowly. He looked at her, and the fever seemed to strip away all the layers of his weariness and guilt, leaving only a raw, painful honesty. "You are trouble for me. You make me remember what it is to feel something. I spent 5 years trying to feel nothing at all." The storm raged outside, a perfect echo of the turmoil inside the cave. The fire crackled, a small, defiant heart of light in the immense darkness. He took a shaky breath. "I have to tell you, in the canyon, when I told you about the smoke, I did not tell you everything." Tala waited, her dark eyes still and patient. She knew this was a different kind of storm, a confession rising from the depths of a soul. "There was a village," he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It was not a battle. We were just ordered to clear it. An old man came out. He was a weaver. I think his hands were stained with dye. He held up a blanket, a beautiful thing, full of patterns, like the ones you described. He was offering it as a gift, a plea for peace. My commanding officer, he laughed. He told the man that we did not have time for gifts. Then he gave the order." Eli's eyes were closed now, but he was seeing it all again. The sun on the blue coats, the terrified faces, the smell of burning wool and juniper. A woman ran from one of the hogans. She was trying to get to her child, a little girl who had fallen. The officer shouted for us to hold the line. He said she was a threat. He yelled at me directly, "Boone, stop her!" It was an order. I raised my rifle. I looked at her, and I did not see a threat. I saw a mother. I hesitated. For just a second. The officer rode past me, and he did not hesitate. He used his saber. I still hear the sound it made. I did nothing. I stood there with my rifle in my hand, and I did nothing. I let it happen. I am as guilty as if I had swung the blade myself. A tear traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He opened his eyes and looked at her, his soul stripped bare. "So you see," he said, his voice breaking, "when I saw you on that block, I saw her, I saw the child, I saw the old man. I was not buying your freedom, Tala. I was trying to buy back that 1 second. I was trying to unfire a shot that was never fired. I was trying to save my own damn soul." The cave was silent, save for the drumming of the rain and the crackle of the fire. Tala looked at him, at this broken man who had confessed his deepest shame. She saw not the monster of his story, but the ghost it had made of him. The weight of his guilt was a palpable thing in the small, warm space. She did not offer him platitudes or easy comfort. She offered him the one thing he had been denied, the truth. She reached out and placed her hand on his, her fingers cool against his feverish skin. "If you saved me to atone for your sin, then you were never free. You were still a soldier, following the orders of your own guilt." Her words hung in the air between them. Simple, profound, and devastatingly true. He had thought he was performing an act of liberation, but he had only been tightening his own chains. To be truly free, he had to face the sin itself, not try to buy his way out of its shadow. He looked at her hand on his, and then back to her eyes. He saw no judgment there. He saw no pity. He saw a deep, sorrowful understanding, the understanding of one survivor looking at another. A great, shuddering sob escaped him, a sound of grief and shame, held back for 5 long years. He leaned forward, his defenses completely shattered. She did not pull away. She met him halfway. She wrapped her arms around his shaking shoulders, and he buried his face in the crook of her neck. He was not a man holding a woman. He was a drowning man clinging to the only solid thing in a world of chaos. And she did not hold a man. She held a lifetime of pain, her own and his. And for a moment, the weight of it was bearable because it was shared. It was not an embrace of passion, but of pure, unadorned humanity. It was the simple, profound solace of 2 broken souls finding an anchor in each other while a storm raged around them. Outside, the rain began to lessen, and the thunder rumbled off into the distance. Inside the cave, in the dying light of the fire, something was being washed clean. The new day arrived quiet and clean, the air washed by the storm and smelling of damp earth and creosote. The fury of the night had passed, leaving behind a fragile peace. Inside the cave, the fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing embers. Eli's fever had broken. He was weak, drenched in a cleansing sweat, but the burning haze in his mind had lifted. He woke to the sight of Tala sitting near the cave entrance, silhouetted against the bright morning sky, watching the plains. The embrace they had shared in the darkness lingered between them, a silent, unspoken acknowledgement of the walls that had crumbled, He was no longer just her captor. She was no longer just his conscience. They were two people, stripped of their pasts by a shared confession, bound by a vulnerability that was more intimate than any touch. She heard him stir and turned. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a new depth, a new awareness of him. She brought him the last of the water and a piece of jerky. He ate and drank, his movement slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving her. The shame of his confession was still there, a dull ache in his soul, but it was no longer a solitary burden. He had spoken the poison aloud, and in her quiet acceptance, he had found not forgiveness, but the possibility of it. "We should move," she said. "They will look for their friends, and men like that do not travel far without others knowing their business." He knew she was right. His body protested, every muscle screaming with exhaustion. But the instinct for survival was a harsh and demanding master. He pushed himself to his feet, leaning against the cool stone of the cave wall. He had lost his horse. They were on foot, with a wounded man and dwindling supplies, in a land that offered no charity. As they started out, walking east towards the distant, hazy line of the Red Mountains, a new dynamic settled over them. He no longer walked in front, the leader. They walked side by side. He was still weak, and he leaned on her from time to time, not with the dead weight of a feverish man, but with the quiet trust of a partner. She accepted his weight without comment, her small frame a pillar of surprising strength. In redemption, news of Jed and Marcus's failure had reached Lyle Brackett. He was not a man who accepted failure well. The disappearance of his hired guns, combined with the story out of Sweetwater about a brawl in the general store, painted a picture he did not like. Boone was not just a drifter with a soft spot. He was resilient. And the woman, she was not a docile piece of property. She was a fighter. Brackett's pride, already wounded, was now festering into a dangerous obsession. He went to the saloon and tacked a notice to the public board. It was a bounty, hand-drawn and written in a crude but clear script. $200 for the return of the Navajo woman known as Tala, $100 for the man, Eli Boone, dead or alive. The sum was significant. It was enough to draw the attention of men who did their work with a cold, professional detachment. Within a day, a trio of such men rode out of Redemption, heading north. Their leader was a tall, gaunt man named Silas Thorne, whose face was a roadmap of old scars and whose eyes were as pale and cold as a winter sky. He was a tracker, renowned for his ability to follow a trail that others would deem invisible. With him were two brothers, Ben and Cole Younger, quiet, competent men who moved with the grim efficiency of undertakers. They were not driven by anger or pride, only by the simple, clean logic of a cash transaction. 3 days later, Tala saw the first sign. They had reached the foothills of the mountains, a broken country of canyons and dry, scrub-choked washes. She stopped, holding up a hand to halt Eli. She pointed to the sky, far to the west. A column of vultures circled lazily in the air. "Too many for a dead coyote," she said, her voice low. "They are over our back trail. Someone found the men we left in the canyon." Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He was a soldier, and he knew what this meant. A hunt was on. He looked at Tala, at the way she stood, perfectly still, her head tilted as she listened to the whispers of the wind. She was not afraid. She was alert, a wild creature sensing the approach of predators. They pressed on, moving with a new urgency, climbing higher into the maze of red rock. Tala led the way, her knowledge of the terrain their only real advantage. She chose paths that would be difficult for men on horseback, forcing them through narrow slot canyons and up steep, rocky inclines. She moved with a silent, graceful purpose, and he followed, the pain in his shoulder a constant, throbbing reminder of their vulnerability. That night, they made a cold camp in a deep crevice between two massive boulders, with no fire to betray their position. They ate the last of their food and shared the last few sips of their water. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air. but they offered no comfort. "This is my fault," Eli said, his voice a rough whisper in the darkness. "I brought this down on you. I should have just ridden away from that auction." She turned to him, her face a pale oval in the starlight. "And left me to whatever fate those men had planned. You made a choice. Eli Boone, we are living with it. That is all." "But I cannot protect you," he said, the admission tearing at him. "I am not strong enough. We should have run. We need to keep running." "And run to where?" she countered, her voice sharp with an intensity that surprised him. "Another town that will spit on us, another desert that will try to kill us. There is no place for us to run to. Do you not see that? This land. It does not care if we are white or Navajo. It only cares if we are strong enough to live. Running is not strength." "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice laced with a frustration born of his own helplessness. "I stand and fight. I get myself killed. That will not help you." "No," she said, her voice softening slightly. "You will not get yourself killed. I will not allow it." The simple, fierce possessiveness of her words struck him silent. She was not talking about him protecting her. She was talking about her protecting him. He was torn between two impossible choices. To stand and fight felt like a suicide mission, a final, futile gesture. To flee felt like the ultimate act of cowardice, a betrayal of the man he was trying to become, the man she saw in him. He felt trapped, not by the bounty hunters, but by his own past and his uncertain future. The next day, the hunters drew closer. Tala found their tracks in a patch of soft sand. 3 shod horses, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. They were good. They were professionals. There was no escape. They were being herded, pushed deeper into the mountains, towards a place where they would have no choice but to turn and face their pursuers. Tala knew this land. She knew its secrets, its hidden places. She led them to a high, narrow ridge that overlooked a vast, empty canyon. It was a dead end. The only way down was the way they had come up. It was a natural fortress, a place to make a last stand. They took cover in a jumble of rocks at the edge of the ridge. From their vantage point, they could see the trail they had followed for a mile back. They would see the hunters coming long before the hunters saw them. Eli checked his Colt. He had 4 bullets left. He had the rifle taken from Jed, with a dozen rounds. It was not much. He looked at Tala. She was not looking down the trail. She was looking at him, her expression serious and unwavering. "You are thinking of making them a deal," she said, "yourself for me." The thought had crossed his mind. It was a soldier's calculation, a sacrifice for a strategic objective. But she saw it for what it was, another attempt to pay a debt, to balance the scales of his guilt. "I will not be the price of your redemption." "Eli Boone," she said, her voice firm, "I will not be used to settle your accounts with God. We are past that." She held out her hand. He looked at it, confused. "The other pistol," she said. "From the other man. You took it. Give it to me." He hesitated. The thought of putting a gun in her hands, of making her a killer, recoiled within him. It was his fight, his sin, his violence to bear. She saw the hesitation in his eyes, and her gaze hardened. "Do you still see me as something to be protected? Something fragile. I put a burning stick in a man's face. I survived the soldiers. I survived you. I am not made of glass. Give me the gun. We fight together or we die together. But we will be equals when it happens." He looked at her, truly saw her in that moment. She was not the captive from the auction block. She was not the frightened woman in the sandstorm. She was a warrior, forged in the fires of loss and survival, with a spirit as hard and as beautiful as the red rock around them. To deny her now would be the ultimate insult. It would be to deny the truth of who she was. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the second pistol, a heavy Navy Colt. He checked the load. It was full. He handed it to her. "But first." Her fingers closed around the grip with a surprising familiarity. She held it with a steady hand, its weight seeming not at all foreign to her. They settled in behind the rocks, side by side, equals in a desperate cause. He held the rifle. she the pistol. They were no longer the rescuer and the rescued. They were two soldiers, holding a desolate ridge against an approaching enemy, their backs to the edge of the world, far below. 3 small figures on horseback appeared on the trail, moving steadily, relentlessly, towards them. The hunt was almost over. The fight was about to begin. The sun beat down on the Canyon of Bones, a place that had earned its name from a long-forgotten skirmish and the bleached skeletons of cattle that had wandered in seeking water and found only a slow, thirsty death. The air was thin and still, baking the red rock until it radiated a dry, suffocating heat. From their perch on the high ridge, Eli and Tala watched the 3 riders advance, their figures small and dark against the vast, sun-drenched landscape. The quiet before the violence was a taut, humming thing, a string stretched to its breaking point. Eli lay flat behind a slab of sandstone, the stock of the rifle cool against his cheek. His shoulder ached, a dull, persistent fire, but his mind was sharp and clear, honed by years of training and the clarity of a man with nothing left to lose. Beside him, Tala held the heavy Colt in both hands, resting it on the rock in front of her to steady its weight. Her knuckles were white, but her breathing was even, her gaze fixed on the approaching men. There was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, hard resolve. The 3 riders stopped at the base of the trail leading up to the ridge. They conferred for a moment, their voices too distant to be heard. One of them, a tall, gaunt man who sat his horse with a predator's stillness, was clearly the leader. The other 2 were thick-set and unremarkable, but then a 4th rider emerged from behind a rock formation, a man Eli had not expected to see. It was Lyle Brackett. He was overdressed for the desert in his fine waistcoat, his face flushed with heat and a kind of manic excitement. He gesticulated wildly, pointing up at the ridge. The professional hunters seemed to be arguing with him, but Brackett's angry insistence apparently won out. So, Eli murmured, more to himself than to Tala. He came to collect his property in person. The arrogance of it was astounding. Brackett was not a fighter. He was a merchant of misery, and he had brought his business to their doorstep. The gaunt leader, Silas Thorne, dismounted, as did the 2 brothers. Brackett, however, remained on his horse, a self-appointed general observing the field. "Stay down," Eli whispered to Tala. "Let them come into the open. Do not fire until I do." She gave a short, sharp nod, her eyes never leaving the figures below. Thorne and the brothers began to ascend the narrow, winding trail on foot, moving with a practiced, cautious rhythm, using the sparse cover of rocks and stunted junipers. They were good. They spread out, forcing Eli to divide his attention. The weight was agonizing. The sun crawled across the sky. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind and the blood pounding in Eli's ears. He laid his sights on the lead figure, Silas Thorne. He was calm, unhurried, a man doing a day's work, when Thorne stepped from behind a rock into a clear patch of ground about 200 yards away. Eli squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a flat, hard crack that shattered the silence, echoing through the canyon. The bullet kicked up a puff of red dust just inches from Thorne's feet. It was a warning shot. "A soldier's message. I see you. Come no further." Thorne dove for cover instantly, as did the brothers. The battle had begun. Gunfire erupted from below, the bullets whining off the rocks around Eli and Tala's position, sending sharp fragments of stone stinging through the air. They were pinned down, the superior numbers and firepower of the hunters making any movement a deadly risk. Eli returned fire sparingly, aiming not to kill but to suppress, to keep their heads down. Every shot was a calculation, a precious resource dwindling away. One of the brothers, Cole Younger, broke from cover and made a mad dash for a cluster of boulders closer to the ridge. Eli tracked him, fired, and missed. The man scrambled to safety, and now the hunters had a forward position, cutting the distance in half. Eli glanced at Tala. She was huddled low, the big pistol still resting on the rock, her eyes wide but steady. "They are trying to flank us," he yelled over the din of the gunshots. "Watch the right side." She nodded again, shifting her position slightly to cover the steep, broken slope to their right. It was a partnership born of desperation, their lives depending on a trust that had been forged in fire and confession. Below, Lyle Brackett was growing impatient. He shouted at his hired men from the relative safety of the canyon floor, his voice a faint, angry buzz. "Get them! Get the woman! I want her alive!" His voice, the voice that had auctioned her off like an animal, sent a tremor of pure rage through Tala. She risked a look over the rock and saw him there, a bloated, preening figure on his horse, a symbol of all that had been taken from her. Her hate was a cold, clarifying force. Another flurry of shots from Cole Younger's new position forced Eli's head down. At the same time, Ben Younger began a perilous climb up the steep slope on their right flank, the one Tala was watching. He was moving from rock to rock, a shadow against the red stone, trying to get above them. Tala saw him. She raised the Colt, the weight of it immense, the sights wavering in her hands. She thought of Eli's quiet instructions. She thought of the burning brand in her hand. She thought of the chains. She steadied the gun, took a deep breath, and fired. The pistol bucked in her grip, the sound a deafening roar so close to her head. The bullet went wide, striking the rock face a good 10 feet above the climbing man, but it had the desired effect. Ben Younger froze, plastered against the rock. His ascent halted. He now knew that flank was not undefended. Eli used the momentary lull to take aim at Cole. He fired, and a pained yelp told him his bullet had found a piece of its target. Down on the canyon floor, Brackett's frustration boiled over. He spurred his horse forward, riding recklessly up the lower portion of the trail, his own pistol now drawn. "He is mine," Tala said, her voice a low, guttural whisper that was more intense than any shout. She ignored the man on the cliffside and turned her attention to the figure on the horse. Lyle Brackett, emboldened by his own greed, had ridden into the open. He was a perfect target. He raised his pistol to fire up at the ridge, a foolish, grandstanding gesture. Tala rested her Colt on the rock again. This time, her hands were perfectly still. The world narrowed to the space between the hammer of the gun and the man who had held the shackles. She saw his face, puffy and red with exertion. She saw the fine waistcoat, stained with sweat. She saw the auction block, felt the phantom weight of the iron on her wrists, heard the crude laughter of the crowd. She squeezed the trigger. The gun fired, and Lyle Brackett was thrown from his horse as if by an invisible hand. He landed in a heap in the red dust, a dark stain spreading across the front of his fancy waistcoat. He did not move again. The horse, terrified, galloped back down the canyon. A profound silence fell. The shooting stopped. The two younger brothers stared in disbelief at the body of their employer. Even Silas Thorne seemed frozen by the sudden, decisive act. Tala lowered the pistol, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel remorse. She felt a great, quiet emptiness. The chains had finally been broken. The spell was shattered by Silas Thorne. He was a professional, and his payday had just been shot out from under the horse. But there was another bounty to collect. He rose from behind his cover, not with a shout, but with a cold, deadly purpose, and fired 2 quick shots at Eli's position. Eli saw the move, but was a fraction of a second too slow to react. The first bullet screamed past his head. The second struck him high in the chest, near his already wounded shoulder. The impact was a brutal, physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and sending him reeling backward. The world dissolved into a universe of blinding pain, and he collapsed behind the rock, the rifle slipping from his nerveless fingers. Tala screamed his name. She scrambled to his side, ignoring the danger. He was on his back, his eyes wide with shock, a terrible bubbling sound coming from his lips as he fought for breath. Blood, bright and arterial, pulsed from the new wound, soaking his shirt, turning the red dust beneath him into a dark, thick mud. Up on the cliffside, Ben Younger saw his chance and resumed his climb. From below, Thorn and the wounded Cole began to advance. Sensing the fight was over, Tala looked from Eli's pale, dying face to the advancing men. A primal, protective fury rose in her, a force more powerful than fear or grief. She would not lose him. She had lost her family, her home, her freedom. She would not lose this man, this broken, complicated man who had seen her, who had shared his own brokenness with her. She grabbed Eli's fallen rifle. She did not know how to aim it properly, but she knew how to fire it. She rested the barrel on the rock and pulled the trigger, firing blindly down the trail. The bullet went wild, but the message was clear. The fight was not over. She fired again and again, working the lever action with a frantic, desperate energy. The hunters were forced to take cover once more. They had not expected this. They had not expected the quiet Navajo woman to become a cornered she-wolf. She glanced at Eli. His eyes were beginning to glaze over. His blood was pooling in the sand, a dark, spreading stain where the life of a man was seeping into the ancient, thirsty earth. Her own tears began to fall, hot and silent, mixing with the blood and the dust on her hands as she tried to staunch the flow. She vowed to him then, a fierce, silent promise whispered to his fading consciousness. "You will not die here. Not like this. I have seen enough death. I will not let this canyon have you." She fired the rifle one last time, then dragged Eli's heavy, limp body away from the exposed edge of the ridge, pulling him deeper into the jumble of rocks. The blood and the red sand mixed into a paste on the ground, a symbolic union of a soldier's sacrifice and the land he had once helped to conquer. The war for their freedom was over. The war for his life had just begun. The night was a long, dark vigil. Down below in the canyon, the bounty hunters did not linger. Their business was concluded, not with a profit, but with a loss and an unexpected ferocity that made the prospect of continuing an unprofitable venture. Tala heard them gather their wounded companion and their dead employer. She heard the soft crunch of their boots on the gravel, the jingle of a bridle, and then the fading, rhythmic beat of their horses' hooves moving away, swallowed by the immense silence of the desert. They were gone. She and Eli were alone with the dead and the dying. She did not allow herself the luxury of relief. All her energy, all her focus, narrowed to the man lying so terribly still beside her. The bullet had entered his upper chest, and while it seemed to have missed his heart, every shallow, bubbling breath he took told her his lung was hit. The wound from the fight in the canyon had been a simple graze. This was a death wound. She had seen men die of such wounds before, their lives rattling out of them with each desperate gasp. She refused to let that happen to him. Working by the cold, distant light of the stars, she did what she could. She used the last of the carbolic acid to clean the wound, her touch a strange mixture of fierce determination and a tenderness that surprised her. She tore strips from her own ruined skirt and from Eli's shirt, packing the wound tightly to slow the bleeding. She knew it was not enough. The real enemy now was the fever that would surely come, and the fire that was burning inside his chest. She pillaged the bodies of Brackett and his men for anything useful. She found a full canteen of water, a small pouch of coins, a few strips of jerky, and more ammunition. On Brackett's belt, tucked into a leather loop, she found a single, heavy iron shackle, complete with a key. It was a tool of his trade, a final, ugly symbol of the man he was. She took it, the cold weight of it, a familiar and hateful thing in her hand. All through the night, she sat beside Eli, listening. She listened to the whisper of the wind through the rocks, a sound like a lament. She listened to the distant cry of a coyote, a lonely, wild sound that echoed her own isolation. Most of all, she listened to the ragged, painful rhythm of Eli's breathing, a sound she willed with every fiber of her being to continue. When he shivered with the onset of fever, she covered him with her own blanket and lay close. offering what little warmth her own body possessed. She was no longer just his companion. She was his shield against the coming darkness. Dawn arrived not with a sudden burst, but as a slow, gentle leaking of gray light into the eastern sky. The gray softened to a pale, luminous pearl, then blushed with streaks of rose and soft violet. The first direct rays of sun touched the highest peaks of the canyon, spilling down the rock faces like liquid gold, chasing the long, purple shadows of the night. The light brought a stark, pitiless clarity to the scene, illuminating the bloodstains on the rocks and the profound stillness of the dead. Tala had not slept. Her eyes were gritty with exhaustion, but her mind was sharp. She knew she had to get the fever down. Leaving Eli's side for a few precious moments, she searched the sparse vegetation growing in the cracks of the rocks. Her grandmother's teachings, long buried under layers of grief and anger, came back to her. She found what she was looking for, a patch of silver-leafed sage, its leaves known to draw out heat and fight infection. She crushed the leaves between two stones, mixing them with a little water to make a pungent, green paste. She returned to Eli and gently reopened the bandage. The wound was angry and swollen, the flesh around it hot to the touch. With infinite care, she spread the cool, herbal poultice over the wound. He groaned, a low, unconscious sound of pain, and his eyelids fluttered. For a moment, she thought he was waking, but he sank back into the fever's grip. She sat with him, periodically dampening a cloth and wiping his brow, her movements a steady, patient ritual of care. As the sun climbed higher, warming the rock around them, she turned her attention to the iron shackle. It lay on the rock beside her, a coiled metal snake, glinting in the morning light. It was the last link to the auction block, the last physical piece of her bondage. She took the rifle and used its stock to dig a shallow hole in the sandy floor of their refuge. Then she built a small, hot fire of juniper and mesquite, using 2 flat rocks as tongs. She placed the shackle in the heart of the flames. She watched as the fire licked at the iron. Slowly, stubbornly heating it, the metal began to glow. First a dull, angry red, then a brighter, more malevolent orange. The heat warped the air above it, making the canyon beyond shimmer and dance. She was not just burning a piece of metal. She was burning a memory. She was performing a ceremony of purification, using the fire to consume the last remnant of her subjugation. A voice, weak and cracked, startled her. "What are you doing?" She turned. Eli was awake. His eyes were open, and though clouded with pain, they were lucid. He had pushed himself up on one elbow, his face pale and etched with agony, but he was looking at the fire, at the glowing manacle. She answered him softly, her voice calm. "I am setting a ghost free." He watched her for a long moment, his gaze moving from the fire to her face. He saw the exhaustion there, the streaks of dirt and blood, but he also saw an unshakable strength, a profound and quiet dignity. He saw the woman who had fought for him, who had kept him alive through the long, dark night. He sank back down, his strength failing him, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. He looked at the glowing iron, then back at her. "Now," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackle of the flames. "Now we are both free." His words, a simple statement of a profound truth, hung in the still morning air. He was free not just from his pursuers, but from the crushing weight of the sin he had carried for so long. And she was free not just from her physical chains, but from the role of victim that the world had tried to force upon her. In the crucible of the desert, in the violence of the canyon, they had forged a new kind of freedom, one that was shared, and therefore real. When the shackle was glowing with an almost white heat, she used the rocks to lift it from the fire and drop it into the shallow hole she had dug. She pushed the cool sand and dirt over it, burying the heat, burying the hate, burying the past. The sand sizzled and hissed, a final, expiring breath. There was no marker, no monument. It was simply gone, returned to the earth. She sat with him for the rest of the morning as the sun climbed to its zenith. He drifted in and out of consciousness, but his breathing seemed a little easier. The bubbling sound less pronounced. The poultice seemed to be working, drawing some of the fire from the wound. She knew the danger was far from over, but for the first time since the shot had been fired, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to take root in her heart. In the quiet of the afternoon, as he slept, a more peaceful, natural sleep, she stood and walked to the edge of the ridge. She looked out not to the west, where they had come from, but to the east, far, far in the distance, beyond the canyons and the plains, beyond the horizon itself, lay the Chuska Mountains, her home, Dineta, the land of her people. She could not see it, but she could feel it, a pull in her soul as real and as constant as the rising of the sun. The desert between here and there was a vast, perilous ocean, but for the first time, it looked not like a barrier, but like a road that led home. She stood there for a long time, a solitary figure against the endless sky, looking east, her heart torn between the man who was fighting for his life behind her and the land that was waiting for her return. The question was no longer how to be free, but what to do with freedom. The Canyon of Bones became their sanctuary and their sick room. For 10 days, the world was confined to the small patch of ground on the high ridge, a world that revolved around the sun's slow arc and the fragile, flickering flame of Eli's life. Tala was a relentless, tireless guardian. The man who had once been her protector was now as helpless as a child, and she fought for his life with a ferocity that left no room for despair. She ventured down into the canyon, retrieved the hunters' horses, and took what meager supplies they had left. The horses were good stock, strong and well-fed, a stark contrast to their own worn-out state. She found water in a hidden seep she remembered from her childhood, a place her people had used for generations. She gathered herbs, chewing willow bark into a bitter paste to fight his fever and packing the wound with a mash of yarrow leaves to keep it clean and stem the bleeding. She hunted, using the rifle with a newfound proficiency, bringing back rabbits and desert fowl to make a thin, nourishing broth. Eli drifted on a dark sea of pain and fever. He was aware of her only in fleeting, disconnected moments. He felt the cool cloth on his forehead, tasted the water she patiently spooned between his cracked lips, and heard her voice, a low, soothing murmur that was sometimes a hum, sometimes a word in her own language, a sound that became his only anchor in the delirium. He was a soldier who had seen the worst of men, a drifter who trusted no one, and yet, in his deepest state of vulnerability, he surrendered his life completely to her care, an act of faith more profound than any prayer. On the 11th day, the fever broke for good. He woke to the soft light of late afternoon, his mind clear for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The fire in his chest had receded to a deep, manageable ache. He saw Tala sitting nearby, mending a tear in his shirt with a crude needle fashioned from a yucca thorn. Her face was thinner than he remembered, the lines of exhaustion carved deep around her eyes, but she was illuminated by a quiet, powerful grace. He said her name, his voice a dry, unused croak, Tala. She looked up, and the relief that washed over her face was so pure and so profound that it took his breath away. She came to his side, giving him a sip of water. He drank deeply, the cool liquid a balm to his parched throat. He looked at the clean bandage on his chest, at the small camp she had maintained, at the 2 horses tethered nearby. He saw the evidence of her tireless labor, of the fight she had waged on his behalf while he slept. "You saved me," he said. The words felt small, inadequate for the debt he owed. She simply nodded, her gaze direct and honest. "I told you I would not let this canyon have you." They stayed for another week, his strength slowly returning. They talked, not of the violence or the ghosts that haunted them, but of other things. He told her of his boyhood in Ohio, of green hills and broad, slow-moving rivers, a world away from the stark beauty of the desert. She told him of her own childhood, of learning the stories of the holy people from her grandmother, of the smell of rain on the dry earth, of a life that had been rich and full before it was shattered. They were no longer white man and Navajo woman, rescuer and rescued. They were just Eli and Tala, two people learning the shape of each other's souls in the quiet aftermath of a war. The day they left the Canyon of Bones was bright and clear. The air was crisp, and a light breeze whispered through the rocks. Leaving the place was a silent ceremony. They buried the last of the dead men, marking their graves with simple piles of stone, an act not of reverence, but of closure. They were leaving the violence behind, burying it in the same earth that held the last of Tala's chains. She helped him onto one of the horses, his movements still stiff and pained. She mounted the other, and for a moment they sat looking back at the ridge that had been their fortress and their hospital. Then, without a word, they turned their horses east and rode away. The land changed as they traveled. The harsh, broken country of red rock and deep canyons gave way to a vast, rolling desert of pale, golden sand. The sun was still hot, but it seemed less an enemy and more a companion, bathing the world in a warm, gentle light. They rode side by side, their pace unhurried, two small figures in an immense and beautiful emptiness. The silence between them was no longer a space to be filled, but a comfort to be shared. They were two solitary souls who had found in each other a cure for their own loneliness. He watched her as she rode, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the distant, hazy line of the horizon. She had a purpose now, a destination that pulled her onward. She was going home. The question that had been a silent weight in his own heart was what he would do when they got there. He could not go back to his old life, to the drifting and the forgetting. That man was gone, burned away in the desert. But what new life could there be for a man like him in the land of the Navajo? He was a trespasser, a former soldier, a ghost from the world that had tried to destroy hers. One afternoon, they were tracking a small herd of pronghorn, hoping for fresh meat. Tala, her eyes sharper than his, took the lead, guiding them through a series of low dunes with an instinct he could only marvel at. She dismounted, handing him the reins to both horses, and crept forward with the rifle, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. He watched her, a woman completely in her element, a part of the landscape itself. She was beautiful, not just in her face, but in her spirit, in the fierce, unyielding core of her that had refused to be broken. She got her shot, the herd scattered, leaving one of their own behind. It was a clean, perfect hunt. As she worked, dressing the animal with a skill passed down through generations, he found himself smiling. It was a real smile, free of the weariness and irony that had been his constant companions for so long. Later, as they sat by a fire, roasting the fresh meat, he looked over at her. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair was a mess, and she was arguing with her horse, which was trying to nibble at their supplies. She was proud, stubborn, and utterly magnificent. The same audacious spirit that had thrown a dusty skirt in a bully's face was present in everything she did. He remembered that moment in the store, the chaos and the danger, and the flash of pure, unadulterated joy he had felt at her defiance. He felt a shadow of that same feeling now, a deep, warm current of affection that was as vast and as quiet as the desert around them. He shook his head slowly, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest, a sound that was still unfamiliar but welcome. "Sweet Jesus," he said, his voice full of a fond exasperation. "You are still trouble." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him across the flickering flames. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile that lit up her eyes and transformed her tired, beautiful features. It was a smile of pure, knowing truth, a smile that held all the miles they had traveled and all the words they had never needed to say. "And you love trouble," she replied, her voice soft but sure. He did not answer, because there was no need. The truth of her words hung between them, as clear and as brilliant as the stars that were beginning to appear in the deep velvet of the desert sky. He did not just love trouble, he loved her. They rode on the next day, and the day after that. The golden desert stretched on, an endless road leading towards the dawn. They were no longer a man running from his past and a woman running from her captors. They were two souls on a single journey, their paths intertwined, their futures an unwritten page. They disappeared into the horizon. Two small figures moving steadily towards the place where the golden sand met the boundless sky, a place where freedom and love and redemption could finally coexist. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the American West. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And remember to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like this video, and hit the hype button to help share this story with others.